Are you like most sales and other professionals who want to grow their wealth faster than what they are currently doing through their company 401k, even with that company match, the stock market, or just plain saving money? Would you sleep better at night if you had the financial freedom to be job optional in just 3 to 5 years through investing in real assets? Maybe you don't want to stop working, but wouldn't it be cool if you could retire a decade earlier than most? And do the traveling you and your family have planned for years while you're still young and can enjoy it? Let's face it, most busy professionals don't have the time or desire to take on more work outside of their W-2 to grow their wealth. On The Wealth Flow, each week we share the stories, the investments, and take a deep dive into the various asset classes that can deliver that accelerated growth to your portfolio passively. That's right. No extra work for you. Instead, we'll put your money to work. Learn what the 95% aren't talking about and join the top 5% of earners today on The Wealth Flow.
All right, welcome to The Wealth Flow. My guest today is Nick Troxel. He is the co-founder of Troxel Fitch, LLC. Nick, along with his best friend Josh, founded Troxel Fitch in 2017. The founders' friendship began in law school at the University of Colorado Boulder. Bound by their entrepreneurial spirit and legal knowledge, Nick and Josh launched their firm shortly after graduation with his vision to build a better law firm in mind. Nick uses his experience, his education, his passion to take his clients to the top. Nick takes pride in serving clients' needs, starting with business formation, continuing throughout the business growth, and providing support beyond. Troxel Fitch, LLC strives to provide high-quality, affordable legal services for entrepreneurs in all walks of life, from venture-backed CEOs to backyard bootstrappers. So, Nick, welcome to The Wealth Flow.
Thank you so much for having me, Keith.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I'm interested in today's topic and just really can't wait to see what kind of light you can shed on, business formation, things that people should be thinking of when they're starting a company. And then, of course, that support that you guys provide along the way. But before we get there, Nick, if we could maybe just go way back and start with kind of where you grew up and what eventually led you to studying and practicing law.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm originally from Lincoln, Nebraska. I grew up there my whole life. For much of my life, I wanted to do something with football for, going forward, right? I played football through my freshman year of college at a smaller school, got hurt, thought maybe do coaching or stay involved in the game somehow. But after I had that string of injuries, basically, I needed something to apply that drive towards that, that I've been pushing so hard in athletics. And so I basically thought, doctor, lawyer, right? Those kind of seem like the highest echelons of professions. But, I pass out every time I get my blood drawn. So I knew I couldn't be a doctor. So then it was, okay, let's do law. My grandfather was an attorney. My mom actually was in law school. She ended up did not graduating after my grandfather passed while she was in law school. But it was something that had been at least somewhat in the family. So at that point, that's when I set out to say, hey, I want to shoot for, and it's funny because actually the day that I went through a string of injuries, the last one, which was rupturing a disc in my back when we were maxing out on squats my freshman spring year playing football. And so once that injury happened, I literally looked up, hey, what's the number one law school in the country? And it was like, I'm going to Yale Law School. Kind of knowing full well that, I wouldn't probably actually go to Yale because, this was already after my freshman year. People who go to Yale Law typically don't just decide on a whim. But it was a good thing for me to shoot towards, right? I've always been the type who, if I don't have a lofty goal to shoot towards, I can, I get bored. And then sometimes that leads to me not, maximizing my talents. And so it was like, hey, let's push hard towards this. Um, so that was really what was started it. Throughout undergrad, always my plan was, hey, I'm going to get a degree in business. Then I'm going to go to law school. I'll practice law for a while, and then I'll get involved in something entrepreneurial. So, ended up getting my degree in accounting because just seemed kind of like business plus, right?
Mhm.
And then, throughout, really had that entrepreneurial itch. Throughout law school, kind of decided, hey, I can scratch that itch while practicing law as well, helping entrepreneurs, being an entrepreneur myself. So that's the long story short on how we got here.
There you go. Okay. Sounds good. No, that's neat. And happened to meet your partner during school. Tell us a little bit about that. You guys just shared some classes together and became friends and decided to go into business.
Yeah, it was even earlier than that. So we actually met at Admitted Students Day, and neither of us were CU initially wasn't either of our top choices. I really thought I was going to move to Los Angeles, go to USC or UCLA. He was thinking he was going to go to University of North Carolina. But both of us, they sat us at the same table on Admitted Students Day. They sat us with Brad Bernthal, who's a professor at the University of Colorado Law School, who's really invested in the entrepreneurial community. And both of us were just so, enamored by this idea of Boulder startup community. Just, I mean, for me personally, I remember coming over when you drive into Boulder. If anybody's been there, you take Highway 36, you get to the top of the hill before you kind of go down into the Boulder Valley. Everything opens up. The Flatirons are right there. It was a perfect Colorado day, and it was like, oh man, I think I'm going to go here. So we connected at that Admit Tuesday. Both of us were still a little bit on the fence. Um, and being both kind of alpha dog types, we were initially like, oh, who's this guy? Who's this guy? But then we reconnected. So first day of orientation, they walk you through how hard law school is going to be, how attorneys can have issues with depression and anxiety and all these things. And when we got out of that presentation, both of us saw each other from across the courtyard. It was like, man, that was a bummer. We got to go. Like, let's go get like a beer and a slice of pizza. So I'm like, we're not going to be those guys who are depressed and anxious. So it was really before class even started. I mean, we basically became good buddies pretty much instantly that first day of orientation. And then, so initially actually it was kind of the three of us. It was me, Josh Fitch, and then our other buddy, Omar Harris. And then, we actually all lived together for 1 year, just, became really good buds. So then Omar moved in with his now wife. Josh and I ended up living together for 7 years as we were in law school and then starting the firm and things like that. So I kind of joke that, especially those pandemic years, Josh and I probably spent more time together than any two people in the world, because it was like owning a business together, living together, and you couldn't really leave or go socialize or anything like that. It was like, that was probably the only time where we were ready to rip each other's heads off at points. But otherwise, we get along very well.
Yeah, yeah, I imagine. Yeah, that's crazy. Just having I can't even imagine. Yeah, that's neat. So tell me a little bit about what you do with to help out your clients. And in particular, I really want to know when it comes to starting a business, because I've made this mistake many a times myself, but where I probably don't think through all of the various facets of what I need to do in the formation of the entity, all that good stuff. But to give us, I guess, an idea on what things people should be thinking of.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the biggest thing that everybody really should do as soon as possible is get some type of limited liability entity formed. So for the most part, for most people, that's going to be the LLC. Maybe sometimes people would do a corporation for various reasons, but you want to set that up as soon as possible, because the reason really when you hear of limited liability company or corporation, they offer this protection called limited liability protection. What that means is when you have a legal entity that's operating the business, that's going out, signing the contracts, going out, signing the leases, going out and, selling the goods or performing the services, whatever it may be, instead of just you as an individual, right? Instead of just getting a DBA or something like that. If you were to face liability, your personal assets would be protected. So if something were to happen and the LLC were sued, they would only be able to come after the assets owned by the LLC. Your personal residence, your bank accounts, things like that would be safe. And so that's paramount, because in business, you're going to have to take risks, right? Opening and starting a business is by default risky. And so you need to be able to take those risks, but in a calculated manner. And so that's so important from the outset, because you don't want to do you don't want to start doing any business where it could have been with you personally, which could then down the road subject you to personal liability. So that's a big first thing. Now, what I like to say is that kind of protection, think about it on a spectrum, right? And so a lot of people think, hey, I can just go file with the Secretary of State and form my LLC. I know how to get the EIN from the IRS. And that's a good first step. But the reason why you really want to work with an attorney is they can help you button up, make sure that you have a good operating agreement in place, or bylaws if you're a corporation, things like that. Because the idea behind this is you want your limited liability entity to be a separate and distinct legal entity from yourself as a person. And the first thing that's going to make it look really buttoned up and distinct is if you have written rules by which it operates and you follow those written rules. And so, that's a big reason why you might want to work with an attorney, because they're going to help you get that buttoned up, make sure that those written agreements are in place, especially if you have co-owners, right? Now, there's always this idea, because what we do ultimately, right, is risk mitigation. And so there can be a tug of war between, well, how much money do I want to spend on legal before the company starts making money and I don't have that much at risk, versus, hey, do we want to get this buttoned up before there's money on the table? And now certainly each entrepreneur has to kind of make that risk assessment themselves. But the reason that we advise, if it's financially viable to get those documents sorted out right away, is it's a lot easier to come to an agreement and figure out how you want to co-own a business before there's money on the table, right? As soon as there's money on the table, people start remembering, well, I was going to get this, right? You said that I was going to, we see it all the time, right? And it's great if you have a business partnership where people can agree down the road and you can, you're able to discuss these things. But we see so often that it often isn't like that. It really makes a better business partnership if you do sort these things out up front, right? Because then you have these difficult conversations. Then there's no resentment, there's no animosity or anything like that, or there's less, right? And so all that to say, huge piece of getting it started right out of the gate is, right, you form your entity. You want to work with an attorney if at all possible, so you can help get those documents buttoned up as well as we're going to provide ongoing best practices, right? So we provide our clients with the best practices playbook that says, hey, when you're operating the LLC, just keep in mind that you need to operate it in this manner to make sure that you maintain that separateness. As well as, for us, we always want to be there kind of for our clients. So once somebody engages us to do those business formation services, we're going to be there to be able to answer, those, because a lot of those quick questions that business owners have at the outset, we can answer without too much time spent or work and things like that. And so, that's a big thing, right? Making sure that you get your entity formed, making sure that you get that buttoned up, separate bank accounts, EIN, everything like that, right? So that's one piece. I would say the next biggest piece is, if you're going to be selling goods or providing services, having a written agreement and a contract, even if it's just a kind of template agreement that an attorney would make for you, to where you're able to just kind of put in names, specific prices and services for that specific transaction, that's going to be huge for you, right? And make sure that you get paid, and make sure that if something goes wrong, you have some legal protection. And it just makes you look more legitimate, right? When you're a new business, you're going to do certain, they have that term, fake it until you make it, right?
Right.
And to some extent, that that's true in a lot of ways, right? Where you can really legitimize the appearance of your business with a sound legal contract, because that shows that, hey, you must be doing well enough that it's worth making this investment, right? That it's worth kind of having this sound legal agreement. Other things to think about that are maybe more situation specific. If you have a brand that right out of the gate, you want to kind of trademark and things like that, it could be good to do that right away. That one can go a little bit both ways, because sometimes it can also make sense to see, hey, how viable is this brand? Is this kind of, do we want to tweak it down the road before you invest in the trademark? But it really could, it can go either way, again, based on your, how much money you have versus how much you want to protect it. Um, and then, there could be other specific things, right? I mean, if you're going to start selling through a website, making sure you have terms of service privacy policy. If you're going to use a lot of independent contractors, having a sound independent contractor agreement, working with an attorney to understand what actually makes a relationship one of an independent contractor versus an employee. If you're going to have employees right out of the gate, maybe you get an employee handbook work and things like that. But I would say for the most part, the one that you absolutely have to do is the entity formation. And then the other ones you have to think about, okay, what is my business? What am I going to do? How am I going to fulfill those services or provide those goods? And then you kind of fill in where you need to.
When you're forming your LLC, you mentioned, meeting and working with an attorney. And, obviously some folks will just go on to a service like a LegalZoom, where it's not going to be as customizable. It's almost like that template that you had mentioned. It's a kind of a template, but what are some differences that maybe when you're working with an attorney, you'll be able to customize the operating agreement in a certain fashion that maybe you wouldn't have gotten from an out of the box LLC that you just get from a LegalZoom type thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the biggest difference you'll see is when there's multiple owners, right? Because you get something off of LegalZoom, typically most, excuse me, typically most first-time entrepreneurs aren't well versed in reading legal documents, right? They shouldn't be. They're not an attorney.
Right.
And so these operating agreements can be fairly robust. They can be fairly dense. They have a lot of, because the idea is that they're very specific. They outline very dense legal topics.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're working with a LegalZoom, oftentimes, you'll put things in, but the way that you're not able to kind of have that interaction where you're really able to say, hey, this is how we want decision making set up. This is how we want money to be split up. This is what we want to happen if we disagree, or if one of us dies or becomes disabled. Or this is, maybe we want our allocations and, the distribution of money to be kind of in a different manner, right? Something on LegalZoom, you're not going to be able to say, hey, well, we want this guy to get paid back his initial investment. We want all kind of the cash flow to go to the guy who put in his initial investment up front. And then we'll switch it to, reversing it to pay this guy out a little bit more, and things like that, right? It's going to be a lot more cookie cutter. There's not going to be ways to kind of customize it and make it really set up the way that you want. And even on a single owner setup, right, is we've seen things where LegalZoom and things like that. The idea behind an operating agreement isn't just to have a piece of paper in place, right? It's to understand what is on that piece of paper and make sure that you're operating your business in accordance with that. And so not only are you able, when you're working with an attorney, they're able to walk you through, hey, this is what you should consider putting in here. This is what we would typically see. This is how you will then execute that, right? Makes it so that you can have that kind of ongoing conversation. Make sure that you don't place these written rules and then go against that, right? Because then it kind of defeats the purpose of having it in the first place.
Yeah, that makes sense. What about a company that maybe was started, through kind of more of a cookie cutter LLC type deal, but you've grown now to a certain point. You mentioned kind of faking it until you make it. Well, now you've started to somewhat make it, right? And so you're looking at it and you're saying, I wonder if my operating agreement is up to par. I wonder if I need to have that looked at. Are those things you can modify down the road, or are you having to basically start or form a new LLC and shift everything to the new one, or can you actually go in and modify?
Yeah. So you absolutely can modify the operating agreement. And I would say, and I know this kind of cuts against my own self-interest in a way, right? But I would always encourage people, if they're on the fence, like, I just can't afford an attorney right now. Should I do LegalZoom or something? Having something in place is, 99.99% of the time better than having nothing in place, right? And so you
Right.
just, think about it on a spectrum where it's like doing nothing is on one end. Well, even just forming the LLC and not getting any operating agreement in place, that's a big step towards, having you protected. And then think of, LegalZoom as a step a little bit further. Working with a good a business attorney is going to be how you optimize and make your, mitigate your risk as much as possible. But certainly starting with a more cookie cutter, getting it in place, things like that is going to be a lot better than doing nothing. And you can absolutely revisit it down the road. Again, the big caution that I would just put there is especially if you have a co-owner, you want to revisit that sooner than later, pretty much as soon as you are financially able to, because the more money that's on the table, the more that there is disagreement, and the magnitude of having this, the consequence of having that disagreement is much, much higher, right? When you're talking about, hey, now we have a $10 million business, we never went back and revisited this operating agreement. The consequence of not being able to figure that out and come together is now you're both potentially losing millions of dollars, right? It's now not just, hey, it's a couple
Right.
$100, couple $1,000 here and there. And so I would always just say that, right? Getting started with the cookie cutter agreement isn't the end of the world. You can revisit it, but certainly just revisiting it as soon as you're able is going to be the best route forward.
How about from a compliance standpoint? Once you've formed an LLC, obviously there are certain obligations that you have to keep that in place to make sure that you're not piercing the corporate veil or the LLC. So tell us a little bit about that. What are some of the things that maybe folks don't always think of or don't always keep up to date that they probably should, or things that maybe could conflict with assuring that the LLC works the way that we were hoping to?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great point to bring up, because that was kind of what I mentioned earlier. Again, thinking of that spectrum, right? And you to be optimized, you want to just always think from a high level that this entity should be operated as its own separate and distinct legal entity. So you want to make sure that always it has its own bank account. You want to make sure you're not commingling your personal money and the business's money, right? Always keep that separate. Always make sure that the way you're paying the money out of your business is in, like, hey, we're cutting a check to XYZ as an employee, or we're making an owner's distribution, right? The money should go client, business, a bank account, then to your personal account, right? You don't want to skip that step, because then it looks like, hey, you're not actually operating that as a separate and distinct legal entity, right? You want to make sure that you're always staying up to date in terms of doing your annual filings with your Secretary of State to stay in good standing. You want to make sure that all the agreements you sign are signed on behalf of the LLC. So Troxel Fitch LLC signs a lease, it should be Troxel Fitch LLC signing that lease, not Nick Troxel personally. Now, if, places may require a personal guarantee on top of that, and that's fine, but then that limits your personal exposure just to that agreement, right? So certain things, leases, loans, they may require that, but and then other things to keep in mind, right? Anytime you're making big decisions, so kind of major, hey, we're going to buy a building, we're going to bring on a new owner, things like that, you want to have written records of that, because really just the way you want to think about it is that you're kind of leaving a paper trail of all the actions that this LLC or corporation takes. And so it doesn't need to be, hey, we decided we're going to spend $10 on getting everybody coffee today, right? I guess you can't buy coffee for $10 these days, but $30 for coffee these days, or $30 for coffee for everybody. That you don't need to think about it at that kind of finite level, but more like, hey, we're going to spend $100,000 to get a truck and wrap it with the company's logos and things like that. Probably worth having a simple writing that says, hey, especially if you have multiple owners, right? Hey, all the owners approve this cash outlay. We're going to go buy this truck. Just because all those things really, you have to think about it like, hey, this LLC is its own entity. It's kind of its own person. It's not you. It's its own kind of person. So how can you record almost that entity's actions and it's like thoughts, right? Or, hey, the LLC needs a new truck, so we're going to do this, right? Does that make sense?
That makes total sense.
And one thing,
And how do you
sorry,
do
go ahead.
that? Yeah, I was just going to say, well, how do you do that? So what specifically do you need to where do you need to put those conversations happened and be able to log that information?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the more formal route, so, and you can talk to your business attorney about getting kind of maybe a template as well of this. But the idea
Mhm.
would be that it's, a consent of, like in a corporation, you might call it board meeting minutes or, annual meeting minutes. In an LLC, you may call it, a consent of the members, or if you're a managed LLC, a consent of the managers. But the idea just being that it's a written record that says, hey, the board of directors made this determination or the shareholders made this determination, and then you write down what that action was, and then everybody signs it. And then you keep it in your kind of corporate minute book. Now, a lot of the times for us, we store so much of this digitally now, right? And so really you could just kind of type up, if you work with a good business attorney, they can put together a template for you where then you could say, hey, on this day, we decided to take, just fill in the date, the action taken, circulate it for DocuSign, put it in your folder on your Google Drive or whatever it is, so that the record is always there. Everybody signed it. That way, everything's just as buttoned up as possible.
Yeah, makes sense. How about, what about other ways beyond just the initial, meeting with an attorney, having them customize operating agreements so that they truly reflect what you're hoping to accomplish with that business? But then from there, throughout the life cycle of the business itself, give us some examples of how that partnership and that relationship with the attorney is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. So really getting it set up from the initial piece, that's a really good first step. The way that business attorneys can really help you going forward is one, they can help you, and anytime you're thinking of pursuing a certain, excuse me, whether you're thinking of pursuing a certain business avenue, whether that be engaging in a new transaction, right? Trying to pursue a new business avenue, selling new goods, providing a new service, or whether you're thinking about, hey, now we want to bring on employees, or we want to start hiring contractors, or hey, we want to raise money, right? We want to raise money and expand into this area, or bring on a new owner, or buy a competitor to expand our business. Think of us as, people who have just, because the attorneys, right? We're the ones who are really writing these agreements, reviewing these agreements. Anytime business transacts, the attorneys are kind of, the nuts and bolts to make that happen, right? We're the ones who write all the agreements, make it happen. And so we're very well versed in how all these transactions happen. And so not only can we guide you through these transactions, right? Hey, typically, hey, if you're going to hire an independent contractor, you want to make sure you have this written agreement. You want to make sure this independent contractor makes these positive affirmations to shift the burden of saying whether this is an independent contractor or an employee, protecting you from those liabilities down the road. Or, hey, you want to raise money? Well, let's make sure that you're understanding what the United States securities laws say is important to make sure that you're not misrepresenting the value, kind of when you're raising money, one of the big things is you want to make sure you're not kind of too pie in the sky, right? Where, hey, this is the best thing since sliced bread. Well, it may or may not be, right? And you don't want to take somebody else's money. And then if things go poorly, well, you told me this was going to be the best thing ever, and now I lost all my money. Now you're getting sued, right? So just that's a sense of these. Anytime you're kind of taking these steps, these are steps that we've, pretty much all of these steps we've seen at some point in some way or another. And an experienced business attorney, any experienced business attorney is going to be should be the same, right? Where, hey, we've seen all of this, and so we can not only provide you guidance on de-risking that transaction, but also, hey, these are ways that you can set it up to kind of optimize things going forward, right? And not just from a, hey, because at least the way we practice is we want it to be de-risked, not just from the sense of having legal rights, legal contractual rights, But how do we make sure that you don't even have to enforce those legal rights? How do we set up the transaction in a manner to where ideally you don't even have to pursue your legal contractual rights? So something that we like to think about a lot is, for example, in a business acquisition transaction, right? You're going and you're buying a business. Oftentimes, all the times, the seller is going to give you positive affirmations called representations and warranties, basically assurances they're giving you about the state of the business. And if those are untrue, there's going to be a corresponding indemnification obligation. So the idea in layman's terms, right? Hey, I'm buying a business. The seller is telling me, hey, the business is this way, right? We have title to the assets. We paid all our taxes. If those things aren't true, and me as the buyer, I incur damages because of that, then I have a legal right to come after the seller and say, hey, you need to make me whole, right? But that's going to require going to court, hire an attorney, paying money, all those things. And so you have that legal right and you protect that, but it's not as simple as, just executing all the time. So what we're going to advise is, hey, ways that you can make this so that it's, a little bit kind of more flowing is, hey, as part of this, let's set up part of the purchase price as a promissory note to the seller, right? Let's say, hey, maybe we'll pay you 70, 80, 85% of the purchase price up front, whatever makes sense in the grand scheme of things, but have part of that on a promissory note where we're saying, hey, if these assurances weren't true, now we're going to just be able to withhold payment on the promissory note. So instead of having to go in, hire an attorney, pay them thousands of dollars, pursue a claim in court, or even if you have the most sound legal rights, you just never know what's going to happen in court, right? Then you have to pursue a judgment, collect against a judgment, right? All that time, all that effort, instead of having to go through all of that, you're able to just say, hey, look, the county sales tax commission came to us. They said that you actually owe, $30,000 on this. We still owe, $200,000 on this promissory note. We're going to just withhold, we're going to basically just set off against that remaining 200K, only pay you 170K more. Then it kind of shifts that burden, right? And the seller, if they really disagree, now they're the ones who have to come in. So that's just an idea of how not only we provide or we aim to provide de-risking and guidance in terms of legal rights, but a big piece of our practice philosophy is how do we help advise people to structure things to avoid having to litigate, to avoid ever kind of being in that position. Because our firm, we believe that really the only people who win in the litigation is the lawyers. And so for us, we want to protect our clients and make sure, hey, how can we be a valuable ally and partner in getting this stuff done to make sure that we protect you, we de-risk you, and that involves not only just legal risk, risk mitigation, but practical ways to execute that.
Yeah, that's a great example. It actually reminds me of something I'm kind of going through right now where I'm finding that I've got taxes that were due on certain things going back. And as I'm trying to switch some of the ownership on it, and this is real estate investing, but where, that's a conversation now I'm having to have, and, hopefully everybody will be in agreement that this is their liability, not mine. But, it's one of those trying to figure out after the fact. And if there is a disagreement, then, that's what I'll have to get attorneys involved. So, very, very interesting stuff. What about the documents that all startups should have in place at the very beginning? You mentioned the entity structure itself, but what additional documents would be good to have from the very beginning?
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of followed up on what I touched on briefly earlier, really having that operating agreement, the organizational documents in place is paramount, right? The next one that's really important, as I was kind of mentioning earlier, is your kind of first contract, right? So basically all businesses, right, are either going to provide a good or they're going to provide a service. That's, that's how you make money. And so having that agreement in place, whether it be the sale of goods or the provision of services, having a at least simple, contract in place to say, hey, I'm going to do this. You're going to pay me this. This is how we determine whether the goods were validly provided or the services were validly provided. This is the standard of which we're measuring it. Having something like that in place is going to be huge. Again, another thing that you can think about is protecting your brand identity or any valuable intellectual property. If you're really doing something that is, if you're selling a creative work, making sure that you have your copyrights in place, right? If you're selling kind of an invention or things like that, making sure that you're pursuing a patent, you're getting that buttoned up, right? A true kind of invention. If you want to protect your brand, making sure you have a trademark in place and have protections in that manner. Again, if you're hiring people, you want to make sure, if you're hiring people, it's very clear you have a employee handbook, or if you have independent contractors. Anytime you're using other people to provide the services, it's really important. I would say that that's a very important thing. Whether you have a document in place or not, you talk to a business attorney, because a lot of people think that, hey, I'll hire independent contractors so that I don't have to pay taxes on their behalf. But what a lot of small business owners don't understand is that's not a decision you make, whether somebody is an independent contractor or an employee. It's all based on what the relationship is in terms of how they're providing the work. You can't make somebody come in Monday to Friday, 8 to 5 p.m. and only work for you and then call them an independent contractor, right? The definition is set by law. And if you mess that up, that can be something that can destroy a business. Because if you've been thinking that you're paying people as independent contractors for 5, 10 years, and the IRS comes in and says, hey, no, these guys were always employees, then you have to pay back taxes for that whole time. And so again, if you're going to have anybody providing services or working for you in any manner, having a discussion with an attorney and then setting up, having them help you set up the relationships, but also have written documentation in place is going to really protect you. What else is good stuff to have at the out? I mean, that's, again, maybe terms of service privacy policy. If you're going to be operating through a website, that can be really important. And understanding what your obligations are in terms of if you're collecting personal information and things like that. I would say those are the big ones to have at the outset.
Okay. Sounds good. And then what about, from a business standpoint, you mentioned a couple examples of, purchasing a business, that kind of thing. But what are some of the things that entrepreneurs should be cautious of when they are buying, whether it be from due diligence, whether it be from, just what are some things that the attorney is going to help you with through that process of purchasing or acquiring a business?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the biggest thing that you want to think about an attorney helping you on a acquisition of a business is, if you go and buy a car or something like that, or something that's more tangible, any kind of, you could take it to a mechanic, right? You can have them look over everything and make sure that what you think you're buying is actually what you're buying. Think of a business attorney as kind of fulfilling that same role with the purchase of a business, right? Our job is to, I think of kind of our role as a two-pronged piece. We can help with the proactive due diligence. So reviewing contracts, reviewing leases, helping guide people through, hey, these are, this is what we want to look at with respect to the risks in the business. But also the preparation of the legal documents themselves, we're getting those assurances via the negotiations of the reps and warranties, via the negotiations of the other legal agreements that are giving the owners not only legal protections if those things aren't true, but they're going to prompt the seller to be forthcoming if any of those things aren't true. Because when you have kind of that setup built in that we talked about earlier, which is typically, how we're going to advise setting up a transaction, the seller knows, hey, I don't want to lose money down the road. So it's better if I just, disclose this type of thing and we can get over this hurdle prior to closing, rather than having this pop up down the road and now I'm losing some of my money. So really our role is to help kind of turn over all those stones, make sure that what you think you're buying actually is what you're buying. Just set it up in a manner to where if what you end up buying isn't what you thought you were buying, that you have some type of recourse.
Yeah, that's great. And do you typically do that? One of the examples, Nick, that you gave was kind of, having a promissory note or some way that the prior owner is receiving payment from you, that you have the ability to make these holdbacks through. Is that typically how it's set up, where it's some type of, hey, we're going to give you X amount for the business, but then there's going to be this portion that, gets paid out over time, giving us a little bit of leverage to be able to assure that, what they're saying is accurate with respect to different, parts of the business?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so every deal is different, but I would say that we do pretty much always push for that, right? And it usually ends up being a situation where it can actually be a win-win for both the buyer and the seller, because oftentimes you can pay a higher overall purchase price if there's more of it in a seller, in a promissory note, because basically you're de-risking it from the buyer's end by saying, hey, we're going to pay you out a little bit over time, and we're going to be able to kind of withhold if these things aren't true, or if you don't meet these certain revenue metrics, things like that. But then the idea is that the seller's actually going to get more money as long as everything is as they say it is. So it could be an attractive proposition for both parties, where it's like, hey, you might be able to make a couple, 100, 150, 200. I mean, just depending on the size of the deal, right? $200,000, whatever, more money in the aggregate, as long as we can set it up this way, and as long as everything is as you say it is. And so it can be an attractive proposition for everybody, because the seller can make more money, the buyer can de-risk the transaction. Now, again, there's going to be times where that doesn't make sense. I mean, we're seeing such a push now in this space that's, entrepreneurship through acquisition, where people are viewing the purchase of businesses as kind of a more of an investment philosophy, right? People want to make investments in these small businesses now because they produce ongoing cash flow. So instead of it being a speculative, hey, maybe this will 10x down the road, this is actually, hey, we're going to be making money, on an ongoing basis. Now, what that has created is that there's a higher demand for these small businesses, and so oftentimes you have to have a competitive bid to be the one who kind of wins the deal, right? So there's always that balance. But what I would say is that being willing to offer a higher overall purchase price on a promissory note, I mean, again, that's going to be an attractive proposition to a seller that has a good business, and I don't say this to say, hey, you should always be skeptical if people just want all their money up front, because there's a lot of reasons why somebody might want that, right? But it's something to at least be aware of. If you're going in, you're looking to buy a business, and the seller is hard line, hey, we need all of the money up front, we don't want to do any kind of seller note, even if the overall purchase price is higher, it's at least a piece of data that you should consider in your overall assessment of a business.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's are you seeing that out in the just kind of right now? It is a time. I mean, I think of just various speakers that I've heard and stuff. I mean, right now is a great time to be buying an existing business. A lot of folks that are starting to retire that have built these businesses, and now they're changing hands. So it is something that's super popular right now, and I would imagine the structure of that, the setup of that, is just critically important. I've heard anything from Nick, even like an example, first a friend of mine just did kind of a franchise, and one of the kind of surprises down the road was this guy that he bought it from didn't keep really good books. Everything was sort of manual as far as the different invoices, and so it was a lot of stuff to go through at the time. But then after the purchase, now he's finding that a lot of the area that this gentleman serviced was what a franchise kind of calls gray area, which means like basically when they sell another franchise in the quote unquote gray area, now all those rights to those customers go to that one. Well, this guy, it sounds like a fair amount of his business was kind of in that area where he thought he was buying, the customer base and everything, but come to find out, because now they've sold another franchise, a good piece of at least the prior customers are no longer available for him. He's not able to do it, but I'm sure some of that could be figured out in advance if you have a good attorney. And then another one I heard recently was just looking at almost like an org chart of the business itself and saying, okay, what are the functions of these people that we're paying? And there was one, and a big piece was going to somebody, and it didn't really make sense, their position within the company. Come to find out, it was one of the bigger vendors that they use, and it's a brother-in-law, and that they were paying to basically get certain deals. So, once that sale takes place, is the value of the business still going to be where the value of the business should have been, right? If we can't assure that without keeping this guy on the payroll, we're going to get the same benefits and same price from them. So anyway.
It's interesting you bring that up, because those would be things that you could absolutely, I've reviewed numerous franchise agreements, and that's what it comes out to. The attorneys really make sure the things that people tell you are reflected in writing, because franchises, you always have to just think of things in terms of how people operate as human beings in their own self-interest, right? And a franchisor, they're going to want to make as much money as possible too, right? We're operating in a capitalistic society. And so if they've signed an agreement that says, hey, you can operate in this geographic territory, these are the rights you're buying, and they're a newer franchise, and hey, you're getting these neighboring kind of pieces because for now, nobody else is operating in those areas. That's something that's good to know, right? And that'd be a simple review of the franchise agreement, right? You have an attorney review that. They can point out, well, hey, you only have exclusive rights in these zip codes, or maybe you don't even have exclusive rights in these zip codes. You just have preferential rights in these zip codes. And so that's something that's huge. And, similarly in the other example you mentioned, one of those representations of warranties you're often going to make is, hey, there's been no state of events that exist that would seem to make your relationships with vendors post-closing any different than they were pre-closing. And so by building in those assurances, now with both of these examples, these should be things you're also mitigating through proactive due diligence. So you're not just finding post-close and having to take legal action. But an attorney would help with that, right? But the legal rights as well would be there, right? To say, hey, show us your org chart. You're setting out who's at will, who's not, Now, again, some of this with a lot of these small businesses, especially when you think about this entrepreneurship through acquisition space, they are smaller businesses. They are, their org chart isn't huge. They are going to have people that are vital and they're key to staying on. And so people, there is that worst case scenario. Hey, you come on, you buy the business. Once you tell everybody post close that you're the new owner, everybody quits. I've never seen that happen, but ultimately the best way to mitigate that is, right, you identify those key employees, and on day one you say, hey, look, I'm really excited to have you here. We're going to pay you a little bit more money, right, to stick around. Right. Ultimately, right, you just have to think about things from a human perspective of like, what do people want as their employees? They're going to want to be valued, all those things. A little bit more money usually goes a long ways as well, right?
For sure. Yeah, no, that's a great point. All right. Now, this has been really good, Nick. I really appreciate it. What are some things, if anything, that we maybe haven't covered that you'd like to share with the audience? And then definitely want to make sure that we're able to share, how people can get in touch with you and your firm.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I would say, just from a high level perspective, I think that what I would say is establishing a good relationship with a business attorney that you trust on an ongoing basis can really benefit your business, and just kind of shifting the thinking of how you interact with attorneys, specifically business attorneys, and not just being, hey, can you put together this legal document here and there, right? Having ongoing conversations, keeping your attorney in the loop of what you're trying to do, because oftentimes they're going to be able to identify places of, hey, maybe, I've seen things done in this manner, or let's set up a contractual relationship to mitigate this risk. And so that way, on an ongoing basis, you're addressing these issues, without having to, scramble on the back end, right? And so I would say that's a big piece for me, because, for example, right now we're dealing with a situation where one of our clients had exclusive distribution agreements with certain vendors. And we're, having to deal, if we would have been kept in the loop from the beginning, we could have made sure that as part of that, other, customers were informed of that. And now we're having to play a little bit of scrambling and trying to exercise those rights again, enforcing legal agreements, which is more of a dispute litigation area, rather than being able to on the front end make sure that everybody knew that, hey, we had those exclusive rights and we're going to operate in that manner. So that's what I'd say. Just really kind of shifting the thinking of, hey, because ultimately, a good lawyer is going to cost you a little bit of money, but a bad lawyer is going to cost you a lot more, or not having a lawyer at all, right? And so really just kind of shifting that thinking of, hey, this is to make sure that you have, you mitigate your risk, you understand what the legalities are, and proceeding in the best way. So, and
Yeah, for
we'd
sure.
be happy to, to chat with anybody. The best way to get in touch with us is just from our website, troxelfitchlaw.com. And from there, there's our phone number, or you can submit a form. We do free 15-minute phone calls if it's something that we think we can help with. And so feel free to reach out.
Awesome. No, that's great, Nick. Appreciate it. And I've got two more questions for you. We're going to put a little spin on one of them, but one would just be, what advice you might give an entrepreneur who's just starting out in their, in their journey as an entrepreneur.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the biggest thing that I always tell people is, I'm a very positive person, right? And I really believe that you can kind of do anything you set your mind to. And so what I would say is, just be willing to go all in and change the way that you view failure. Because ultimately, every time you fail or every time you may have a misstep, it's an opportunity to learn and adjust. And it's something that is going to help you actually in the long, if you're too afraid of failure, you're never going to have those learning lessons to actually grow. Because to me, the only real failure is giving up. And so I would just say any first time entrepreneur, you know, just put your mind to it, go all in, be willing to fail, be willing to pick yourself up and dust yourself off and learn and keep growing. Because ultimately, again, the only real failure is if you give up.
Yeah, that's great advice. Appreciate that, Nick. And then how about book recommendation? Doesn't have to necessarily be law related, but it certainly can be. Just something you've read recently that's been impactful.
Yeah, absolutely. So I recently read a book for first time entrepreneurs. I read a book called Profit First. That was a good insight into operating your business in a manner that is as financially viable as possible. The big takeaway from that is you should always take money for yourself off the top instead of thinking about, hey, I'll pay myself someday down the road. Because the more that you can think about taking your money off the top, it's going to make you more efficient with the rest of your finances and expenses and things like that. So I thought that was a good book, as well as recently read a book called Traction, which is about implementing what's called the Entrepreneurial Operating System (EOS). That's good. That's a good book as well for first time business owners. And then one book that actually Josh told me about years ago that's not so much business focused, but that was a great book for me to read. It's called The Untethered Soul, and it's about kind of optimizing your own mental health, happiness. It's basically the idea of like, who are you? Are you your thoughts? Are you the voice in your head? And yeah, I mean, it sounds kind of out there when I explain it in that manner, but it really is about, hey, how do you live each day to the max, maximizing your happiness, mitigating your fear, your anxiety, your anger, right? How to let those kind of emotions that don't serve you kind of pass through you and recognize that that's not who you are and that's not what life is about, and focusing more on how you appreciate every day and every moment.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. All three really good book recommendations. So fantastic. Well, Nick, this has been fun. I appreciate you joining me on Memorial Day, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Being that you're still here, I trust you found value in this episode. I personally wish I would have known these guests and strategies when I started my wealth creation journey. Go to wealthflow.capital to subscribe to our newsletter. And as a free gift, we will send you our quarterly market report and the top 10 things to look for in an investment opportunity. Take a minute to give our show a rating and review. Help us reach 1 million professionals by subscribing and sharing this episode with someone you know who could also find value in it.